Hey, welcome to the show. We're going to talk about the Chinese social credit score system today. Something I've been studying for a couple of years and recently found out that what I was led to believe through numerous articles and videos was completely wrong. And this system doesn't actually exist, which kind of blew my mind completely. And so I spent a couple of days really digging in, going through some additional material with a new perspective, and it's true. So let me break it down for you in this episode. Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Molly Elmore. A couple of years ago, I think probably around March of 2020, I was awakened to a great many things about our world, things that I had no idea were different than I was led to believe. And I think many of people went through a similar experience, not necessarily at the same time. And one part or sort of like consequence of me going through this like awakening process was to learn about money, was to learn how money works. And there was a lot of people at that time who were kind of issuing warnings that this very dark dystopian system was going to potentially be coming, and it was going to be very, very different than life as we know it, money as we know it was going to change, and all these things. And this kind of led me onto this multi-year journey that took me to this channel where we discussed the future of money. And a key part of that journey for me was to learn about this system that was coming for us in the West, where social media was going to be connected to potentially your health information, which is going to be connected to kind of this carbon credit thing, which I didn't even know about what that was back then. And it was all going to be kind of connected to your money. And when all of these things were sort of together, then it would give somebody who was in charge of that system an incredible amount of control and authority over your life. And it was really scary. And it was kind of hard to believe. But the way that became a little more real feeling was to point to a system in China. We were kind of warned, hey, this system pretty much already exists and it's being used in China. It's called the Chinese social credit score system. And I read quite a few articles back then that sort of explained how it worked, and it was scary and it freaked me out. And it kind of that's sort of what led me to crypto, was hearing about central bank digital currencies and what that meant. I didn't know how that worked. And this sort of took me down this whole journey of looking into, discovered Bitcoin and then a bunch of other cryptocurrencies and digital assets after that. So I've been in this sort of rabbit hole for quite a few years. But it all sort of hinged on this thesis that I took to believe as fact early on. And that was this Chinese social credit score system was sort of the model that the West was likely to experience as well at some point. And I've written articles about this. I have done videos about CBDCs. I have written tweet threads, and they all kind of hinged on trying to predict what was going to happen in the US and Europe and the UK based on what I believe to be happening or already have happened in China. Now, I've never been to China. I don't know any people who currently live in China. That's not true. I didn't until recently know anybody who currently lives in China. And so I really had no way to validate that this was true. But I didn't just read one thing. Like, there was a bunch of things, and there was other people who had this belief system too. And so, I wasn't relying on one data source. So in my view, I was kind of done my research and that I believed that this existed. So a couple months ago, and I've talked about this in my channel here, I joined a community with economists, geopolitical analysts, and financial investors and that type of thing. And it's an amazing group because there's a very international crowd in there. It's not only Americans, it's global. And not everybody has the same viewpoint, but what I like about it the most is that we can discuss somewhat heated and controversial things without people getting emotional and calling each other names and getting heated. So I can really try to discern someone else's viewpoint to sort of see how that fits into my analysis. And as an analyst trying to figure out stuff in the future, like, I have to be able to take in different viewpoints to sort of figure out what do I believe that turns out to be incorrect, and what is correct. That's kind of the process for me of analyzing, is knowing that I have a whole bunch of info. Some of it's got to go, some of it's got to stay. New information is going to come in so that my thesis is continuously evolving. About a week ago, or a couple days ago, it's been a long week, a person in this community who has shared incredible insights with me about a few different topics, smart guy. I think he's American, or definitely from an English-speaking country. We all kind of do this through Slack, so I've never spoken to him. We just sort of do this written. Anyway, he lives in Taiwan and has lived in Beijing and has a tremendous amount of knowledge about China's history, China's culture, what's going on in China, what Chinese people feel about certain things. And I had written a thread or a comment to somebody about CBDCs and how what I thought was going to happen in the US. And it kind of referenced this Chinese social credit score system kind of in passing. And he corrected me and said, just so you know, like, that doesn't exist. And I was like, what do you mean it doesn't exist? Seriously? And he's like, yeah. And he pointed me to a couple of things that I went through. One was kind of a video that broke down why this is a made up idea. And then a bunch of articles that we're going to go through screenshots of this together in this video to sort of show you that the media made this up. And at first, I was mind blown. I was like, what do you mean they made it up? And then I was like, wait a minute. This is hardly the first time the Western media has misrepresented something. Why am I so shocked here? And I think it's because it didn't seem like it was, something that was pro-Western. Like, in 2020, we had a lot of media misrepresenting things, saying something was scarier than it was, or something that's not a big deal, but is. So I'm kind of used to the media misrepresenting things. For some reason, though, I didn't think it didn't make sense to me why they would lie about this Chinese social credit score system. So that is going to be the last part of this video. I've spent days on this. I'm going to break down my analysis about why the media has been lying to us about this. And it's part of a bigger goal. Who's behind it? Who benefits from it? Sort of this understanding of incentives. If you're going to ever analyze geopolitics, I truly believe that you've got to figure out who benefits, who's incentivized, what are the motives. Otherwise, a lot of things don't make sense and you're just kind of guessing. So first thing we're going to do is go through a couple of articles that the mainstream media or well-known publications have published. This isn't just like some random guy's blog. And we're going to break down how the headline is very different than what you actually see in the article, which kind of proves that this was a very much misrepresented thing. All right, the first article we're going to look at is from the South China Morning Post. So instantly this article would have some credibility, because if it's a media publication based in China, you might think they would know what they're talking about. And this article is a couple years old, I think. It's from 2020. So this is about around the time that I was sort of studying this initially. I don't remember every article that I read back then, but this very likely could have been one of them. And it's very direct. What is China's social credit system and why is it controversial? Seems like a perfect article I would have wanted to have read back then. It's a set of databases and initiatives that monitor and assess the trustworthiness of individuals, companies, and government entities. A good rating could offer priority health care or deposit-free renting of public housing, while a negative rating could see individuals banned from flights and trains. So that sounds pretty scary. Like, if you get this good rating, you have lots of perks. If you get this bad rating, you get scary consequences. Now, I live in the US and we are very much dependent on credit, like financial credit. So I'm used to this idea of a credit score, in that if you have a very high credit score, you get advantages, like you could borrow money inexpensively. That's basically the primary advantage. If you have low credit, you could have to pay a lot of money to borrow money, or you could be told no. That could ultimately affect your ability to even open accounts with maybe something like a utility. But my credit score in the US, like it's not something that really affects very much of my life. So this came across as something quite different in terms of how it's applied. Now, this software I'm using reorders slides, so I might have to jump around a little bit. All right, and I did take this screenshot today just to be like, you know what? If someone went and looked this up, what would you get? So I Googled Chinese social credit score system, and this was sort of the first thing that popped up in Google. Is sort of like the little paragraph there referencing Wikipedia. And this very directly says the social credit system is a national credit rating and a blacklist developed by the government of the People's Republic of China. That's pretty direct. And this is what something that I led to believe was true. And we're going to explore in depth in this video. The idea is that the government, what is the equivalent of the federal government of China, created this system. And I assume that means they maintain this system. And in it, you have a credit rating in this system, and you could potentially be blacklisted. So if you do bad things in this centralized system developed by the federal government of China, you could be blacklisted given consequences. And we just saw in the article, it could mean you can't buy a flight or you can't go places. That's key because this is not true. Okay. And this is going back to the South China Post article. I'm just going to read some sections of it because as we go through, I want you to pay attention to that thesis. Are we confirming a centralized federal government database or set of linked databases that the federal government issues consequences or rewards for? Okay. A good rating will lead to rewards, while a poor rating will see an individual or company punished or sanctioned. That sounds scary. Individuals who are deemed untrustworthy could face a number of restrictions affecting areas including loans, traveling by air and rail, as well as education. So that confirms what we read in that sort of headline. And also this word of like being untrustworthy. That's sort of an interesting label. Like that's subjective. Who decides what it is and is not trustworthy? All right, now here we go. Local governments, so China's a big country, right? So there's all these regional governments within the sort of bigger structure, kind of like states, federal government. Local governments are also required to submit information, including their finances, to the centralized system. Interesting. So local government is accountable to the federal government. According to Chinese court rules, local governments are deemed untrustworthy if they have failed to pay contractors on time or have fabricated data. Government officials, in some cases, are then prevented from buying tickets above economy class on flights, trains, or ferries. They are prohibited from racking up large bills at high-end hotels, nightclubs, and golf courses, as well as from buying or renovating property. Okay, wait a minute. This is very different. So now we have the federal government who's keeping tabs on local government who is spending what I'm going to call taxpayer money, but like the government money. And if they don't spend government money correctly, like they don't pay their bills or they fabricate data, meaning they are lying, corruption, then there are consequences for government officials. I actually have no problem with this at all. Like this is how it would work in a company, right? If I'm the CEO of a company and one of my departments is stealing money, like there would be consequences for that. So the federal government, in order to minimize corruption at the local level, implemented a system for essentially their employees of a sort. Realize they might not like sign their paycheck, but they're probably getting government, federal, the equivalent of federal money. And if they misuse it, they don't pay the bills, or they try to buy first class tickets for travel, possibly for work travel, they're not going to be allowed to do that. So this is quite different than what the initial article made it sound like. This isn't for random people. This is for employees of the government spending, government money. All right. Individuals or firms who have been blacklisted over minor offenses can apply to have their status restored when they have repaid their debts and have maintained a good record for a certain period of time. When we discuss restoring credit, it's mainly aimed at minor or regular offenses. Those who have committed serious offenses or violations will not be taken off the blacklist. Their untrustworthy record will be kept for a long time according to the law. Now, what actually is going to come out to be this is it very similar to our US credit system. Like if you have not repaid your debt, if you default on a loan, your credit rating is penalized. That's what's happening here. So if you don't pay your debts in China, which is exactly the same as not paying your debt in the United States, your credit score is dinged and it's very difficult to fix that. If they said it's a minor thing, yeah, you can fix it, which is actually probably better than the US. Very difficult to repair your credit in the US. You have to kind of go through quite a process, hire people in some cases. But in China, if you really default on a loan pretty seriously, you're kind of stuck, which is very common in the United States. So far, I'm not seeing much different other than they have a good system to maintain or manage corruption at the local government level. Okay. Might be different. I know it's the same article. Why has China set up a social credit system? The aim of this system is to improve transparency for the public, although it also serves as a tool for the government to impose control on almost all aspects of citizens' lives. Ooh, we're back to sounding scary again. The idea of establishing a nationwide social credit system has been discussed for some time, particularly in the financial sector over the past decade. But the proposal to construct a social credit system reaching beyond the financial sector was formally put forward in 2011 and then announced by then Premier Wen Jiabao. The lack of creditworthiness in society is still quite prominent. Despite being prohibited, commercial fraud, counterfeiting, selling fake goods, making false reports and false claims, and academic misconduct continue to take place, and the people are very dissatisfied. So it looks like they did propose 10 years ago to set up a system that wasn't just about defaulting on loans, but covered in things like fraud, counterfeit, selling fake things, making fake false reports, false claims is a bigger deal. Now, the question comes, well, who decides what is a false claim? That I realize that is subjective, but it doesn't really look like this is different than the laws that we have in the West. Like if you file a fake police report, like that's a crime. If I file a fake insurance claim, that is a crime. So again, we're back to pretty much the same thing we have in the West. So I'm not seeing really much difference just yet. All right, what is the progress of China's social credit system? For now, the system is still under development and relatively fragmented when it comes to data sharing between different databases. According to the data from the People's Bank of China, the nation's central bank, the social credit system already covered 1 billion individuals and 28 million companies by the end of 2019. Many of these have already been rated and some have even been blacklisted. The NDRC said in July 2019 that 2.5 million people had been restricted from taking flights, 90,000 people had been prevented from taking high-speed services, and 300,000 people been deemed untrustworthy by Chinese courts. Now, what's unclear is whether this is really any different than the US system. Other than the fact that, let's say you were a business and you borrowed a bunch of money and you didn't pay it back. I guess in the US you could file bankruptcy and kind of get away with it. But let's say in China, if you borrow money and you don't pay it back, you are punished, penalized in a credit way, and you're then not able to use a credit card to buy stuff like flights or anything. Again, I had been led to believe this was a very different thing than what this article, when you break it down, is sort of pointing to be. In 2019, the PBOC attempted to ease concerns that the system was becoming too intrusive in the lives of the public, saying it had not yet collected any data concerning utility payments. China's central bank also said that although the new system was capable of adding data concerning water, power, and telecommunication bills, the information would be collected only with the approval of individuals involved. Companies, particularly foreign firms, are concerned with large data transfers that are likely to include sensitive data, such as technological details and personal information, according to the report by the European Chamber of Commerce in China. While the criteria does not formally discriminate against foreign companies, however, they remain vague and could be difficult to avoid, particularly for foreign companies. All right, so now the real story is starting to emerge. that the concern is not citizens who are getting in trouble for not paying their phone bill. The concern now is that foreign companies that are operating in China may experience a level of scrutiny that they do not want. They may not want their phone records analyzed by the government of China. They may not want their personnel records analyzed by the government of China. So this is going to be a big part of the analysis. So just remember that this article is making the bigger point that it's foreign companies that have the concern, not necessarily individual citizens who just pay the bill on time. The European Trade Group was also concerned that the blacklisting mechanism for heavily distrusted entities may also turn the corporate social credit system into a tool for trade conflicts. Based on a draft published by the Chinese government in 2019, companies can be listed as, quote, heavily distrusted market entities for different reasons, including carrying out fraud, coercion, malicious collaboration, endangering the national or public interest, and infringing on legitimate rights and interests of customers. While criteria do not formally discriminate against foreign companies, they remain vague and can be difficult to avoid, particularly for foreign companies, said the European Union Chamber of China. The report also highlighted that the criteria were similar to the measures mentioned by the Ministry of Commerce when it announced that it was compiling an unreliable entity list amid the trade and technology war with the United States. So now the narrative is emerging that this really isn't about Chinese citizens. This is about China being distrustful of Western companies operating in China for potentially nefarious reasons, whether these companies are participating in fraud, coercion, malicious collaboration. There's a whole list of things that the Chinese government would consider a threat to China. Very different than what we were led to believe in the beginning, that this is the Chinese government terrorizing citizens. Remember this for the analysis because this is very important. Okay. Different article, Wired Magazine. Again, pretty mainstream. Never had a reason to believe that Wired Magazine would make stuff up. The complicated truth about China's social credit system. China's social credit system isn't a world first, but when it's complete, it will be unique. The system isn't just as simple as everyone being given a score, though. Ooh, that sounds creepy. China's social credit system has been compared to Black Mirror, Big Brother, and every other dystopian future sci-fi writers can think up. The reality is more complicated and in some ways worse. Well, that sounds scary. This is also an older article, and I'm pretty sure I probably read this back in 2020 when I was initially researching this, but I might not have dug, I doubt I went through it through a fine-tooth comb like we are right now, because this was a new idea to me back then. And around that time is when my husband and I watched Black Mirror. I was totally freaked out. There's this one episode about this girl who has like her Facebook app that rates you like everywhere you go, and she ends up kind of bumbling some things, and her score falls, and she can't rent a car, and her whole life is sort of like ruined in like a period of 2 days. Very scary and very dramatic. And that show, I know a lot of people watched that back then, really shaped this idea of like this terrorizing system coming. And when we were led to believe that this exists now in China, it was like really freaky. And I bet you back then, I don't remember, it was years ago, when I saw this Black Mirror thing, I'd either just watched it or went and watched it because of this, because I remember that summer I watched that show. Okay. Brits are well accustomed to credit checks. Data brokers such as Experian trace the timely manner in which we pay our debts, giving us a score that's used by lenders and mortgage providers. We also have social style scores, and anyone who shopped online with eBay has a rating on shipping times, communication, while Uber drivers and passengers both rate each other. If your score falls too short, you're out of luck. So it's true. In the West, we have a variety of different social credit systems. If you want to participate in e-commerce, eBay and Uber are great examples that if you have a really bad score, people aren't going to want to do business with you. It's sort of, if you watch my video about atomic settlement, it comes back to this idea of counterparty risk And that if I'm going to have a transaction with you and there's risk that you're not going to do what you say you're going to do, then we need this sort of rating system to do it. So it kind of makes sense. It's not a dystopian thing. You don't have to participate with eBay if you don't want to. But if you choose to be in that marketplace, they need a system to establish trust. So again, having that is not a dystopian government surveillance tool. All right, what is China's social credit system? Unveiled in 2014, places of the system are already in place, and the Chinese government appears to be targeting 2020 as the goal to get the rest in place. Although that's less a deadline and instead marks the end of the planning period, says blah, blah, blah. As yet, there's no one social credit system. Instead, local governments have their own social record systems that work differently, while unofficial private versions are operated at companies such as Ant Financial, better known as Sesame Credit. Ant Financial is the payment arm of Alibaba. The systems use shopping habits, among other data, to inform credit style scores on an opt in basis. There is no single nationally coordinated system, Olberg says. The pilots that do exist don't all work in the same way. This absolutely contradicts what Wikipedia says, that there is this CCP controlled database or set of databases that are used by the government to enforce their particular policy. This Wired article, when you get into the detail, it says there isn't one. There are many local ones. Again, it looks like there might be some problems with local governments in China being corrupt. So the federal government has implemented their own system to make sure that if they're stealing money or doing bad things, that they have a consequence system to weed out corruption. Very different than what I was led to believe. This leads to misunderstanding of what the social credit system actually is, notes Olberg. What happened is some of the media took the private pilots like Sesame Credit and presented it as the social credit system. It's not officially part of the system. It doesn't have a license. Although the pilot is approved and indeed encouraged, it could one day be shut down by the government. It kind of rides on the fashion for social credit. What's troubling is when these private systems link up to government rankings, which is already happening in some pilots. You'll have a sort of memorandum of understanding, like arrangements between the city and, say, Alibaba and Tencent about data exchanges, and including that in assessments of citizens. That's a lot of data being collected with little protection and no algorithmic transparency about how it's analyzed or spit out a score or ranking. Again, local governments connecting with private companies. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it contradicts this thesis that Xi Jinping and the central government of China has implemented this system. They're flat out saying that doesn't exist. Local governments have done some things with some private companies, which again has some concerns, but isn't really a national rolled out thing. How does the social credit system work? The target eventually is that the government system will be countrywide, with businesses given a unified social credit code and citizens an identity number all linked to a permanent record. If you go to a Credit China website, you have an entity's credit code. You can type that all in and pull up credit records. Individual have an ID linked code. It's less a score and more of a record. So we already have this in the US. If you go to Experian or TRW or Equifax, then you can pull up your credit score. If you have a business, you can also get a credit score for your EIN number. So this is not any different than what we have. All right, what happens if you're blacklisted? So Li Hu is a journalist in China writing about censorship and government corruption. Because of his work, he's been arrested and fined and blacklisted. Liu found that he was named on the list of dishonest persons subject to enforcement by the Supreme People's Court as not qualified to buy a plane ticket and banned from traveling some train lines, buying property, or taking out a loan. There was no file, no police warrant, no advance notification. They just cut me off from the things I was once entitled to, he told the Globe and Mail. What's really scary is there's nothing you can do about it. You can report to no one. You are stuck in the middle of nowhere. What recourse is there? With the government system, if you want to be removed from the blacklist, you can either pay your bill or appeal to the court. So, did this happen because he didn't pay a bill? That's different than you being a journalist and writing something unfavorable about the government and being blacklisted. Because that's what this was initially painted to be, is like if you dared to speak out against the CCP on social media and your social media post was labeled fake news, you would be blacklisted and couldn't buy a plane ticket. That's very different than having a bill to pay for something and not paying that bill, and now the government has implemented a system to get you to pay the bill. Like that, I still don't know if I love the idea of not being able to buy plane tickets. You don't pay your bills, but I don't think that's an unreasonable system. And that's very different than this dystopian control mechanism. It's essentially just saying, pay your bills. Okay. More and more, I'm seeing this is the same as Western credit scores. While it varies by program, in some local pilots, a positive rating means discounts and benefits, such as a simplified process with bureaucracies. If you have low credit rating, you may have extra paperwork or fees. Once you're in a low category, it makes it difficult. I see a huge potential for negative spiral. Such a system could further divide society, creating classes of people depending on their social credit. And this is where comparisons to Black Mirror pop up. All right, this is absolutely the system we have in the West. If you have a high credit score, you can do all sorts of financial things very quickly. Like I have a high credit score. If I want to click to do any kind of get the thing now, pay later, I'm pretty much approved without an issue. If I apply for a new credit card, I'm approved. If you have a very low credit score, your life is very different and you can't get those loans. So there is definitely a system in the West, in the US, that this exists. So this is not some kind of like unique Chinese thing. This is what companies that we live in this sort of credit dependent world. And if you're in the business of lending money, we currently have a system that rates you on your worthiness of credit risk. So what they're calling, and maybe it's a translation thing, what they're calling trustworthiness, which sounds like this very different thing, it's really like credit worthiness. Why is China building this? It's all about building trust as a Chinese government. Again, I don't speak Chinese. I don't know what the original Chinese thing was, words that the Chinese government said, but it might be that this is the context about credit. Like if you're going to be borrowing money, we have to trust that you're going to pay it back. As Chinese society does have trust issues, we're going to talk about this in a minute, very big. It can be food quality scandal, pollution, or employees not paying their workers, but the system can also be used to enforce vague laws like endangering national security or unity. This, again, is going to tie to an international thing more than it is within citizens. Zhang says that can include food safety, product air quality, major problems in the country. It's a big problem in Chinese society. They're punishing companies for this kind of bad behavior. China has a history of the West messing with things in China to cause trouble for a bunch of nefarious reasons. China is scarred from this and paranoid about it. This is what I'm relaying as an analyst that I've recently learned. I don't have an in-depth history of China, but I've spent a while digging into this. It's quite fascinating. It all kind of makes sense that if you're a country that's been beaten up in the past, you're going to be guarded in the future. And that's what a lot of the policy we're seeing right now is a somewhat paranoid, but possibly justifiably paranoid reaction to things in history and developing mechanisms to ensure that foreign entities do not come into China to do things like poison people, which is horrible, or implementing, pollution, other types of things that are harmful to Chinese citizens. So I think this situation has been very misrepresented by the media. Steeped in cynicism, the West sees this stance as bluffing or posturing. What values, they ask, lie behind this new order? What economic model? Implying again that universal conformity is mandatory, thus missing Zhang's point completely. Universality is neither necessary nor sufficient. I think actually we might be out of, I have a problem that this software has put things out of order. Okay, sorry. So this is what this should be. The world map accelerating its shift away from the paralyzed Washington hub, but to what? The myth that China, Russia, or the non-Western world can be fully assimilated to a Western model of political society is over. So where are we headed? So what we're going to kind of talk about in the next couple of minutes is this idea that China believes, in my analysis, I'm not saying these are facts, that the West kind of wants to push Western model of politics onto China. And they might see that Western model of politics as being corrupt and uh, serving the political machine maybe more than citizens. I'm not saying I disagree with that. The bigger point here is that the former wounded civilizations are reasserting themselves, China and Russia. So China and Russia in history have been at the losing hand of the relationship with Europe and the UK. There's a long history there. The British sort of introducing opium in China and creating this sort of organized crime syndicate that was very profitable for organized criminals out of Europe. And Russia has had a lot of very brutal wars with Europe that has created a lot of scars and distrust. So, all right, as states organized around indigenous cultures, this is not a new idea, rather a very old one. Always remember that China is a civilization and not a nation state. And that's something that's tricky for an American. Like United States is very diverse culturally. And so we're also a very young country. The US has only been around for a couple hundred years. And most people here originally came from somewhere else. So the kind of part of the American idea is this sort of melting pot idea. We have some cultural values that are kind of related to politics, like Bill of Rights, American dream type of thing. But there isn't this thousands of years of cultural identity that you have in a place like China and you have in a place like Russia. Like Chinese civilization goes back thousands of years. They've been through quite a few political structures. The political state of China has changed. It's been under sort of a king type structure. It's been under communist type structure. It's been under more democratic. Like it's been through a variety of things, but at the root of it, Chinese people still see them as part of this Chinese culture more than they are citizens of the current state. Hopefully that makes sense. And that is something so this is sort of the idea is that they feel like Europe, which Europe as an entity doesn't even really exist. Like there's many countries in Europe that sort of have this sort of alliance, but there's no European culture. Like there's Italian culture and Spanish culture and Greek culture. And that's sort of getting pushed aside as Europe sort of moves away from national identities. And that is not something that China nor Russia like. They're like, we like our Chinese culture. Like we have a long history. We want the Chinese people to benefit. We want the Chinese people to thrive. You're sort of coming in saying we need to be part of this one world government thing. Like we're not, anti-religion of sorts, anti kind of history. And that is a threat to Chinese civilization. Such notions are not confined to the Orient. Samuel Huntington, in his book, The Clash of Civilizations, argued that universalism is the ideology of the West contrived for confronting other cultures. Naturally, everyone outside the West, Huntington argued, sees the idea of a one world as a threat. This speaks to plural civilizational matrices precisely is intended to break the West's claim to speak or so decide for anyone other than themselves. So this sort of thing we've been going through the last couple of years, kind of called the Great Reset. I don't know if I'll get in trouble with YouTube for talking about that. It's sort of this movement of shifting towards this global governance, one government, one monetary system, one set of rules, one set of decision makers that aren't necessarily elected, very removed from any individual's cultural identity, moved from anyone's cultural history and religion of that region. And a lot of so the point of this article was that a civilization like China feels very threatened by a one world government model that would essentially tell the Chinese people, you no longer get to keep your civilization. You have to be part of this global community that we decide your cultural values. What lit the fuse was the moment when China's leaders saw, in the plainest terms, that the US had no intention whatsoever to allow China to overtake it economically. That's sort of, all right, what the spark was. Russia, of course, already knew the plan to destroy her. Even the smallest amount of empathy is sufficient to understand that recovery from profound trauma is what binds Russia and China and Iran together in joint interest that transcends mercantile gain. It is that which allows them to say never again. So we're witnessing with this emergence of the BRICS nations, this alliance between Russia, China, Iran, other countries like South Africa, Brazil potentially. And one thing that this article says is that Russia and China and Iran have this history of being mistreated, that's sort of an understatement, by the West. And they are traumatized from it. It's made them distrustful as a result. And when they hear Europeans or even Washington sort of say, you should adopt our model, it's kind of like, you know what? You treated me once badly. I'm not going to go there again. Like, we just don't trust that your leaders in the West are honest. And that's sort of the heart of what is unifying Russia and China in this current age and situation, according to this article. Be that as it may, Zhang and others have noticed that the Western focus on finance has come at the expense of stuff and has proved to be a recipe for extreme inequalities and social strife. Zhang argues, contrarily, that China is poised to evolve a new kind of non-Western modernity that others, especially in the developing world, can only admire, if not emulate. So the point here is that they're saying that the West is really fixated on the money thing, which is this credit system of giving loans and paying interest, and everything is all about like the financial markets and interest rates. And this, if you watch the financial news at all, the stock markets are hanging every word on Jerome Powell's interest rates and whether or not you can borrow money cheaply or not. It's kind of consuming the financial market. So I would agree with this, that the West is very focused on the money side of a market, where the argument here is that in China and Russia, they're more focused on the products that they're making or the resources or commodities that they're producing. And if you are too focused on the money thing, kind of reminds me of the IMF and World Bank, where they issue these loans and it creates this debt slavery system. And when the money is being issued out of nothing, which is the case with the dollar in many cases when these loans are given to countries, it creates an inequality. And this isn't necessarily at the citizen level, it's at the country level. If I'm a poor country and I get indebted to the IMF, like that creates a lot of problems that are not easily solved. Steeped in cynicism, the West sees this stance as bluff or posturing. What values that they ask? This is where we talked about this before, that universality is neither necessary nor sufficient. It never was. So the Chinese aren't interested in this sort of one world, we're all the same type of thing. They're like, we have our cultural identity and we want to keep it. In his address, Xi attributed the breakup of the Soviet Union to ideological nihilism. We'll talk about that word in a second. The ruling strata, Xi asserted, had ceased to believe in the advantages and the value of their system, yet lacking any ideological coordinates within which to situate other thinking, the elites slid into nihilism. Once the party loses the control of ideology, Xi argued, once it fails to provide a satisfactory explanation for its own rule, objectives, and purpose, it dissolves into a party of loosely connected individuals linked only by personal goals of enrichment and power. The party is then taken over by ideological nihilism. And he was referring to how the Soviet Union broke up. And the Soviet Union was not a Russia thing. It was a European construct where they wanted all of these different nations in Asia and Western Asia to be grouped together into kind of a Europe. Like the USSR was sort of like Europe. They took these very different cultures, put them together, and tried to come up with this unifying thing. And it didn't work because the party didn't really have something that they stood for. And it got taken over by this ideological nihilism. And I didn't actually know what that word meant, so I had to look it up. Nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. That is a pretty depressing take. And I can see why, if you had this world leader approach your country and say, hey, come be part of our club, and it reeks of no religion, if that's a part of your culture, that's a problem. It reeks of no morality, and the concept that life is meaningless, meaning there's no God, there's no sort of life purpose. It's all just you live and then you die and then that's it. So Xi was saying that that's what killed the Soviet Union, was they weren't a part of a culture that felt like they had a moral compass and a religion that gave them a connection to some sort of spiritual thing, God, whatever. And that was their downfall. And Xi, I think, doesn't want to get into a situation that reminds him of that. This, however, was not the worst outcome. The worst outcome, Xi noted, would be the state taken over by people with no ideology whatsoever, but with an entirely cynical and self-serving desire to rule. So I took this as this is what he believes that the Davos crowd is advocating. They have a self-interest to be the rulers of the world. They want this one world system. They want to take over, but not because they're like inspired by some sort of calling. It's really just selfish greed. And they don't have any inspiring purpose that is going to unify people behind it. So he's like, no thanks. This, I think, is the root of why China is like not interested in what the WEF is doing or the UN or any of these European led movements right now. And they are pretty much rejecting all of the advances from Europe, as is Russia. There can be little doubt President Putin would concur with Xi wholeheartedly. The existential threat to Asia is to allow its states to assimilate into a soulless Western nihilism. This, then, is the crux of the Xi-Putin revolution, lifting the fog and blinkers imposed by universalist meme to permit states to return to cultural rejuvenation. So this sort of alliance of BRICS is saying, you know what, no thanks, we don't want to be in your club. We want to be our own sovereign nations with our own cultural identity and not be part of your depressing the world sucks type of movement. All right, a little bit back to the social credit score system. I just wanted to make sure before I wrap this up that I wasn't finding anything that validated that this thing does in fact exist. And no, it doesn't. It kind of talks about the idea. The headline usually sounds really scary. It has these freaky pictures of everybody being like visually monitored and assigned their little ID number to match them up. But then when you dig in, again, it's local companies local city councils working with tech firms to monitor. So I'm not saying there aren't any problems in China. I'm sure there's plenty. But this thesis that it is the CCP who has implemented this system, article after article, when you dig into it, it's false. I also found an article that I'll put the links to all these articles in the description if you want to read them all yourself. But it also has nothing to do with foreign. So people who are tourists had gone to this article. I think it was written for them in mind, because it's written in English, saying, hey, if you go to China, like, do you need to be worried about this if you're a tourist? And this article says basically, no, you don't at all. This program focuses entirely on Chinese citizens, and some sources, including this article published in Foreign Policy magazine, claim that China's social credit system isn't even real. So an article that just wrote about it is also saying, you know what, not everybody thinks it's real, which I found interesting. All right, this is getting kind of long. I want to wrap up and talk about some key things, which are motives. All right, why would the media lie about this? That was my first question. Like, they lied. They made this up. They've obviously exaggerated and misrepresented what this thing is. Why? All right. So we talked about this a little bit. This European crowd wants this one world government idea. And one thing they implemented a couple of years ago was a tax for all countries, especially those with money, have to pay this big tax. It started with the Paris Climate Accords. You have to pay this tax essentially to the lord of the manor. It's kind of like feudalism, where you have this sort of lord is in charge, and all the other little farms on the whatever property have to pay a hefty tax to the lord of the manor. You also have to stay in your place. You cannot become too big or too strong. So I don't know if you noticed when I said it, but one thing that China mentioned was they were aware that the West wasn't going to let China get too big. Since the 1980s, China has gone from an incredibly impoverished country to being a global superpower. That's no simple accomplishment. They have incredible work ethic. They have focused on manufacturing products that they export They've made a ton of profit. That profit has been invested into a tremendous amount of infrastructure projects. A lot of them probably were poor choices, but they have a much more modern society than they did 20, 30 years ago. Also have a military, which they never had. And that eventually becomes a threat to the other superpowers who are like, wait a minute. We wanted you to be like our workers and make all the stuff for us, but I don't want you to get too big. Like, you got to remember your place. And that is a key thing to understand in this geopolitical battle. This group in the European crowd also expects all of the participating nations in their alliance thing to put the interests of the alliance ahead of their national interests. We've seen this repeatedly, where countries will harm themselves to the benefit of the alliance. And it makes no sense why a government would do that unless they're sort of beholden to a power that is higher than themselves. All right, so then they also have, these countries all have to participate in a loan system that generates interest and payments for specific banks. These banks are generally in the West. These banks make a lot of money off of these loans. Almost all of these countries in the world have this loan system. It's kind of crazy. And then the other thing that's key to understand is that this Western group, based out of, we call them Davos, they implement or dictate rules. Their new label for themselves is their rules-based order. And they will say, you have to do these things. You have to shut down or implement these rules on airplanes or have this kind of database to track people. That's coming from the West. And they're saying that if you don't comply with our policy, that's a problem. Like, compliance is 100% mandatory. And let's just go back quickly into China's history to see why some of this makes sense now and why China is rejecting the Western advantages and has become paranoid that they're being infiltrated and manipulated by organized crime from the West. So the 1800s, there was a sort of a dark history with opium being introduced from the British, and this created this British drug dealing culture that created organized crime. We've seen this in other countries. It certainly exists in the United States, that when you sort of have drugs come in and you get drug dealers, and now you have all this money, and it creates this subculture. The mafia has done it as well. And that was not something that was native to China. That was introduced from the West. China, as I mentioned before, has a very long history as a civilization. And these periods in history where Europeans have come in and attempted to colonize or steal resources from China has created a distrust of foreigners. I got to say, I don't blame them. If that were me, I would probably be distrustful too. China also has a China first policy, which I find that strange if you are the leader of a country and you don't have that policy. Like, if you're the president of a country and you're not like advocating for that country, it's like being the CEO of a company and being like, yeah, I kind of don't really care about my company. I'm just more concerned with the industry. You should be fired as a CEO. China also does not have any incentive to be subservient to these European leaders. China makes a lot of stuff. They export a lot of stuff. They make a lot of profit. Granted, they have overspent on infrastructure, but they have the ability to make more money. Like, they make stuff. A lot of countries in Europe don't make anything. They don't have income coming in from resources that they either get from the earth or produce in some capacity. So what is the incentive for Xi Jinping to be subservient to Davos? What does he get from that? I don't know. I don't think much. The country of China will also seize opportunities to advance China. So they've had this remarkable situation where the West doesn't want to make stuff. So we've been buying China's stuff for decades now, and China has profited from that immensely. Why would they say no to that? China also, this isn't supposed to be like a fluff piece, like China's so great. It's just, I'm trying to understand what the motives would be for the media to lie about this thing. And it kind of ties back to the fact that there's a history here and that the European cartel wants China to be on board with their agenda, and China is not. China, though, has a lot of people to manage, so I don't think that is a simple thing, which is why they do have some systems in place to keep track of people and, have some kind of semblance of law and order. The United States is not all that different, although we have probably way more problems with crime and chaos, especially the last year or so in cities. You just see the insanity going on with people shoplifting and there's no consequences for it. It kind of creates a very unhealthy society. So if China's doing a better job of that than us, like, okay, this is where the rebellion comes in. So China was benefiting from trade with the West. A lot of products in Europe and US are made in China. When did this rebellion start? So the first time that I kind of noticed it was with this Paris Accords that we talked about in a second. And China, makes a lot of stuff. So they're sort of labeled this like carbon producer, like one of the worst producers of carbon or carbon dioxide emissions. And each country that is a super producer or whatever label they've come up with it is expected to pay this sort of tax, and China's just not paying it. They're just like, no, they didn't pay. You're not pay. It's like the mob, or you got to pay 10% to the big guy. You got to pay up. They're just not doing it. They also had a very different reaction to the medication that came out in 2021 that was mandated in a lot of places, and it had a particular advanced technology. Don't want to get in trouble in this video by getting into details about that at all. Just know that that was not implemented in China in the same way as it was in the West. We're also seeing this alignment with Russia that relates to this shared history of sort of bad experiences that made them distrustful. Now, right in the last year, and especially even in the last couple of months, we've seen these lockdowns with this sort of zero C policy in China. It makes people wonder, like, why would you harm your own industry and make life miserable? Well, one theory that I recently came across that kind of makes sense. It's hard to validate any of this stuff, by the way. These are just my interpretations, so none of this is fact. Is that Chinese people are very entrenched in their culture and they're not leaving China. But if you make life miserable for Westerners who aren't committed to China, it might be a way to get rid of a lot of annoying people who are there for nefarious purposes. So the thesis was, what if this sort of zero C thing was intended to make life hard so that the sort of fair weather residents would leave? And they have been leaving. It's just miserable there for them. And that, the Chinese are going to suck it up because they know they have to, and it will sort of rid of these bad actors who are maybe starting riots and starting protests and interfering in things that maybe wouldn't have occurred naturally otherwise. There also were some disruptions to some bio products that the West needs. And the lockdowns do affect production of that. So I'm not going to get into that anymore, but just that's sort of part of the consequences that China may have been intending. So what is the goal of Davos that they're using the media for? Why would they want me and you and anybody else living in the United States to believe that China has this terrible, scary social credit system that they don't have? Why would you want that? Well, what if one of the ways the West intends to get out of the financial mess that they're in is to have another war? The Middle East war was incredibly profitable. Trillions of dollars went into this black hole. Nobody really knows where it went. So we're just supposed to trust that it was all spent responsibly. Julian Assange kind of woke a lot of people up to the fact that was never the case. So if there was an intention to start a new war with China, it would be a great way to distract everybody from other problems. Well, right now, Americans would be like, I got no beef with China. Like, they seem like fine people, like, whatever. Well, if you start to paint this picture that they're these terrible, evil dictators, it will help get American support for a potential military operation. So you got to paint the leader as this evil dictator who oppresses his citizens. Actually, when I was writing these, I was like, this sounds remarkably familiar to the Gulf War and how Saddam Hussein was painted as this really evil, terrible guy, which I never really knew if that was true. And we went and attacked Iraq without them attacking us first. And at the time, I was bothered by that. I'm not a fan of war at all. And we were sort of left to justify, while all these Iraqis were killed and their cities were decimated as the US bombed everywhere. But it was like justified as well. He's this really bad guy anyway. Well, really, all he had wanted to do, which I learned many years later, he was interested in selling oil in a currency other than the dollar. So the media kind of portrayed a different situation. Now, do I think Saddam Hussein was a good guy? Probably not. I don't think any of these leaders are necessarily good people. But I think that it's very likely that the media misrepresented a situation to get Western support for that military attack. Seems. Got interrupted for a second. So the goal possibly is to just paint Xi Jinping as this terrible, evil dictator. So if there were some sort of provocation that justified military action, you would have the Western civilians like me and you on board. Wars serve a purpose for certain groups. They're used to cover up money laundering. They're used to create profits for the military industrial complex and the sort of weapons industry. There also is devastation that happens in wars where some banks issue loans after and they make a lot of money off of sort of rebuilding and restructuring. So unfortunately, this is gross that this is sort of reality, but there are groups of people who find wars incredibly profitable and beneficial, regardless of the fact that tons of innocent people are going to be harmed and damaged. The other sad reality is that financial resets happen after wars generally. The last major reset was Bretton Woods after World War II. There was also one after World War I when the pound kind of fell from grace. And so it's likely that if the sort of Davos crowd who doesn't have control of the dollar, if they want, they've been on a relentless case to sort of demonize the dollar, which, whatever. Not saying I totally disagree or like the pros and cons to the dollar system. But if you wanted to get rid of it, it would be easier to do that after a war because the party with the most money at the end of the war, the winner of the war, gets to make those rules. So it kind of also creates another incentive for a war situation. And I wouldn't want that. It just sort of helps explain why China is being painted in this bad light. And maybe all of this is some of the bad things are true. I have no way to know if they are or not. What I found just insanely bizarre was that I had believed for a couple of years about this social credit score system. And when I dug into it in greater detail, it turned out it's not real. Blew my mind. So this video is a little bit longer than I had intended. Thank you if you made it all the way to the end. I appreciate you. If you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. This is, an analysis. This is not a set of facts. I'm not saying that this interpretation is correct necessarily, but makes a lot of sense to me. And this is why I kind of put this together for all of you. If you liked the video, please like it. That helps me with YouTube. And subscribe to the channel if you want to watch some videos in the future. And I will see you in the next one.